slightly to the bigger size anyhow, let's say so. The yearly budget of the faculty is 28 million euros. Something like 40% of that is external funding. I mean research funding obtained from the national funds and the European, whatever, international funds. So we are rather good in this, and we want to be even better in this respect. So here we are then, we have 13 academic disciplines. Too many, I would say, but I mean, this is where we are. Because some of them are very small, but of course they are important and they are traditional ones, so we are keeping all of them aboard. As you can see, there is a strong number of disciplines with social in the name on the right-hand side, and then there are some others which are not labeled as social, but include very strong social science, scientific, if you like, emphasis there. I'm not going to how to say, present all of them, so it is just the figure 13, and you can find development studies here, you can find political science, you can find all these different subjects that you might, different disciplines you might represent, they are there. So we have 4 bachelor's programs in our national languages, which means we are a bilingual university in Finnish and Swedish. We have 7 master's programs. It is a very new, how to say, rather recent tradition having these uneven figures of masters, of degrees studies, because only 1 year ago we established the new structure here. So 4 bachelor's, 7 master's programs in national languages, and then 4 master's programs in English, international master's programs. And we are doing quite well in student-wise. I think it's about 10% of all applicants can get in to our faculty. So we are leaving 90% out. So we are rather good quality students, if you like. So these are then the 4 areas of focus areas of research at our faculty: inequality, justice and security, democracy, opportunities and threats, mind, understanding and participation, and social knowledge and expertise. So these cover quite well the research that is done, done at the faculty. Of course, not everything that we do can be, how to say, subsumed under these titles, but I mean, these are the focal areas we try to develop further and try to go into more depth into these areas. So we have at the moment 5 research units. The first one is just concentrated on the European studies, European and Nordic studies, if you like. The second one, criminology, and the third one, consumer society research. They are of national character, so they are within our faculty, but they do have a special tasks or duties on the national scale, and funding also from the ministries. Then the method center, it is still under development. It is not so easy to establish a totally new one, covering all these 13 disciplines here. But we are trying to get there rather soon. And then the last one, which is the Helsinki Graduate School of Economics. It is a joint institute of 3 universities: Helsinki University, Aalto University, which is more sciences, and then the Swedish-speaking university in Helsinki. So it's one of those, let's say, flagship initiatives nationwide. So the idea is to concentrate, I can say here, concentrate economics to Helsinki, and especially to this, both the higher studies and the research to this institute. It is supported by the National Bank and the ministry and everything. So it has good resources. We hope so. Some update to the end of the presentation. We are just in the process of establishing a new major research center or institute at our university, which is now the working title is Social Sciences and Humanities Research Institute. So it's an attempt, first of its kind in Europe, I think worldwide, to establish a joint research center for 5 faculties representing different humanistic or human sciences. It means social sciences, faculty of arts, faculty of theology, faculty of education, and faculty of law. All these 5 together, we try to establish something with the help of the university, of course, the governing board. The governing board is expected to make the decision in early October. And of course, it's a question of resources, how we shall then get funded for this institute. But I mean, we have a rather good, vibes are rather good at the moment. So then, finally, there are a couple of profiling actions in research which are funded by the Academy of Finland. They are they are products of national competition. So each year, the Academy has announced quite much money to be, allocated to those kind of profiling actions, and we have managed to get our hands, if you like, into 3 of those actions, and here are they by name. Again, they are multi-faculty enterprises. For example, the first one, which is here, inequality, well-being and security, it covers 7 faculties at the Helsinki University, and we are the coordinating faculty there. The others, they are also multi-faculty enterprises, initiatives, and we shall see if they are then leading to the establishment of more, long-standing institutions or centers. It is not yet quite clear what is going to happen then afterwards. So these are the small words about the faculty. You have a full program here. You have a number of very interesting presentations. I don't want to take your time more here. So what I want to say only is then that I wish you all success in your conference. I hope you have a full program and you enjoy yourself very much at Helsinki, and have a nice day. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Welcome everybody. It's a great pleasure to have you all here. Thank you for traveling all the way to Helsinki, and we are very excited to have this 4th World Ecology Research Network conference here, after being Hampton and several other places around the world. And maybe a few words about the key initial idea of the theme of this particular conference. So one of the initial ideas was to bring together different conversations that are trying to go beyond the Cartesian dualism, the nature-society dualism, to challenge this dualism and search for post-Cartesian concepts and ways of understanding the world. And for that reason, we have first here in this plenary session talking Jason W. Moore and then Marisol de la Cadena, and they both are presenting different kind of approaches to tackle with this problem that we have currently in our societies of this long-lasting nature-society dualism. So Jason W. Moore comes more from the background of world systems analysis, looking at regionally situated world ecologies, such as commodity frontiers, and how they create capitalism as a frontier. And then we have Marisol de la Cadena, who has more a background of an anthropologist and science and technology studies and so on. And she has spent a lot of time in the Andes and has been part of this new project of political ontology. So these are quite distinct approaches, but still we are trying to look in this conference for ways for them to debate and have a nice conversation between each other. So please, maybe this is something that can be kept in mind also in this session. And we will first hear Jason and then Marisol, and after that we will have questions, so please retain your questions until the end. So first, Jason W. Moore, he's an environmental historian and historical geographer at Binghamton University, where he's professor of sociology. He's author or editor, most recently of Capitalism in the Web of Life, Anthropocene or Capitalocene, Nature, History and the Crisis of Capitalism, and with Rai Patel, most recently, A History of the World in 7 Cheap Things. And Moore has published widely on environmental history, political economy, and the history of capitalism. And many of his readings are available at jasonwmoore.com. And he's also the coordinator of the World-Ecology Research Network. And after Jason, then we will have Marisol de la Cadena, who is a professor of anthropology at the University of California at Davis. And her maybe most famous book is called Earth Beings, Ecologies of Practice Across Andean Worlds, but she has written extensively on other topics as well, for example, about Andean social movements and so on. And now she's working in Colombia, trying to conceptualize, create new concepts to challenge what exists and what cannot exist, creating onto-epistemological openings, as she calls them, of which you will hear more soon. So please, welcome, Jason.
What a pleasure it is. Thank you, Markus, for organizing this. Thank you for and introducing me. Thank you to Sofia Agolani Alba for doing innumerable things to make this possible, including my own arrival and presentation here. Quite lovely and possible. So the clicker, here we go. So. It's so exciting to see so many new comrades and so many familiar faces as well. Bear with me as I clock up my own notes here. I want to emphasize from the outside that the world ecology is not a perspective. It is not a theory. It's not. We have no party lines. Many of us here feel like we don't fit in the conventional scholarly and academic boxes, and we are looking for new ways to think and to be creative and to act in generative and productive ways for climate justice and other forms of planetary justice. So, if I can, here we go. So what I want to talk about today is climate change as geohistorical event and its implications for planetary justice. And we can start with the obvious, that Eurocentric knowledge is ill-equipped to grasp the 21st century's climate crisis. We are, of course, barraged by daily reminders of the unfolding crisis: droughts, typhoons and hurricanes, new diseases and new disease geographies, the acidification of the oceans, the endless assault on biodiversity. Sometimes humans are allowed to be part of the story. Climate refugees, the homeless and dead after severe weather events, fire brigades on the front lines of wildfires which now rage endlessly from Santa Rosa to Sweden. To be sure, the human role has been emphasized as just that, the human role. Climate change, after all, is anthropogenic, human-made. Ours is, to quote the new and important book by Maslin and Lewis, a human planet. We are all invested, we are told, in the future of something called the human enterprise, an enterprise sure to reap handsome profits, if only we can all just pull together as a team. The human enterprise. Now there's a deliciously neoliberal term. It's a phrase that Anthropocene advocates relish. It appears literally hundreds of times. The human enterprise. Audaciously blending and blurring Star Trek space communism with free market triumphalism, that phrase, the human enterprise, tells us something crucial about the long arc of the global environmental imaginary since 1968. Anthropocene advocates like Will Steffen seem to have picked it up from Paul and Ann Ehrlich, and yes, we'll have reason to return to them, who coined the term in the late 1980s. So if that name, Paul Ehrlich, sounds familiar, it should. Before the Anthropocene craze, there was another, more fundamental watershed in how we imagine environmental crisis. Its text was Paul Ehrlich's 1968 blockbuster, The Population Bomb. It remains the best-selling environmentalist book of all time. You can guess Ehrlich's central thesis from the title: too many people causing all the world's problems: famine, war, poverty, you name it. The cause of too many people? Well, Ehrlich had a simple and straightforward answer. It was human nature. It was a problem rooted in, as Ehrlich wrote, billions of years of evolution. Aha. Not capitalism, not imperialism, not class society, billions of years of evolution. All right, so we need to ask, who made planetary crisis? Ehrlich's metaphor, the population bomb, was tightly linked to another, spaceship Earth, reinforced by iconic images like Earthrise and the blue marble, which you see up here. Ehrlich considered titling his book, Our Spaceship is Bursting. Spaceship Earth as an idea was a peculiarly American formulation, fusing post-war techno-futurism with social democratic managerialism. Coined by the quirky inventor and architect Buckminster Fuller in the early 1960s, Spaceship Earth became modern environmentalism's first super metaphor. It was one of those metaphors that scarcely demanded clarification, especially in the space race era. Leading establishment intellectuals and politicians like Barbara Ward and two-time presidential candidate Adlai Stevenson snapped up the term without delay. For Ward and Stevenson, and later for Richard Nixon, just a few years later, the moral challenge of saving the global environment became a powerful tool of the world's 1% at a time when their rule was challenged as never before. Notwithstanding Bucky Fuller's anti-Malthusianism, Spaceship Earth was rapidly deployed with a decidedly populationist bent. Man, Paul Ehrlich announced in 1969, is not only running out of food, he is also destroying the life support systems of the Spaceship Earth. So powerful was the metaphor that a documentary, The Survival of Spaceship Earth, was commissioned as the semi-official film of the landmark 1972 Stockholm Conference on the Human Environment. Funded, let us note, by the largesse of Arco, the oil company, and organized by a Canadian petrocapitalist. So, lest anyone be unclear about the politics of this documentary in 1972, The Survival of Spaceship Earth, it opens with a 30-minute dissertation on population as the root of all the world's problems. So, this is the emergence of Spaceship Earth as the environmentalism of the rich. And sorry, I just momentarily, my notes momentarily disappeared. Thank you. Let's see, there we go. And so we want to come to grips with this environmentalism of the rich, conjuring images of human unity, the whole Earth, and a Star Trek-style egalitarianism. Spaceship Earth promised technological liberation from social ills and effective planetary stewardship. These, of course, are themes repackaged and announced as novel ideas in the popular Anthropocene conversation. Spaceship Earth provided a powerful frame to make sense of population, resource use, and pollution as planetary problems at a time when global elites were under severe challenge. From within the core, of course, the worker and student and other revolts of 1968 to 70, but of course, worldwide in the anti-colonial struggles against American empire, not least in Vietnam. The power of the concept derived from a flexible and persuasive fusion of two essential claims that have run like red thread through modern environmentalism. One, we are all connected, and two, we're all in this together. Its stealth claim is more subtle. Not only are we all in this together, but we created this disastrous situation together. So what I want to say is that if the Earth is a ship, it's not a spaceship, it's a slave ship. If there is a human enterprise that's planet Earth, it is a firm with a CEO who earns 500 times the salary of its workers. If there is an Anthropocene, it's an era when some humans turned most humans and the rest of nature into profit-making machines. So what, we might ask, is the alternative? Well, I think that this conversation is part of the effort to generate alternative ways of thinking, not just alternative ideas or propositions, but an alternative mode of thought to deal with questions of climate crisis and climate justice. So crucial to the world ecology conversation is indeed the fundamental connection of life and power, work and justice, care and play. With modern environmentalism, we share the insistence that yes, indeed, we are all connected on planet Earth. But humanity did not create the present disastrous state of affairs. We know who is responsible. We know who owned and traded slaves. We know who carried out modernity's genocides. We know who financed the modern world's great wars and great dispossessions. In other words, we know who is responsible for today's planetary crisis, and they have, as Utah Phillips reminds us, names and addresses. But we have to go deeper than this. As Marx would say, capitalists often know not what they do. They are, we all are, caught up in the violent contradictions of a violent system with definite rules of reproduction. To say that the modern world is a capitalist world ecology is to say at least two things, not just, but at least. First, that no exercise of power and domination, exploitation and resistance between humans is outside the web of life. And second, that there are definite rules of reproduction through which the capitalist world ecology has worked for the past 5 centuries. When many of us say that we live in the Capitalocene, not the Anthropocene, we are saying precisely this. Capitalism is a system of cheap nature that works in and through great movements of domination, exploitation, and appropriation. So, this means coming to terms with the forms of work and breaking with the rigid formalism, both of environmental thought but also of Marxist thought, that we need to chart new analytical and conceptual terrain if we wish to forge a unified politics of climate justice. So how does this kind of conversation allow us to make sense of climate change today? Let's begin with 2 major ways of reading the climate crisis, one as geophysical tipping point, the other as geohistorical event. So here, these images will be very familiar to you. These are the various scenarios. Nobody believes that we're going to even hold the line at 2 degrees Celsius increase, which even 2 degrees means 6 to 7 degrees increase in places like Southeast Asia. Here we have the Malthusian assumption underlying ecological footprint thinking and also arguments about state shifts. The earth scientists are absolutely right. We are indeed living through a state shift, an abrupt and irreversible change in the web of life. But we also need to deal with climate crisis's geohistorical event, which means that we have to put these images together. We have to understand rising CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere with the tendency of the world rate of profit to fall, or with the ongoing exhaustion of capitalism's cheap food model that has been so successful for so many centuries. So what I want to do here is to contrast very briefly 2 charts. This is a chart that shows us the ups and downs of climate in the northern hemisphere over the past 2,000 years, more or less. And you can see that the proxies have to do largely with solar maxima and solar minimum, so how much solar radiation is coming into the Earth and not, and then volcanic eruptions. So this gives us a very good sense of climate history as geophysical history, and that's hugely important. But how do we fold that into something more interesting? Well, here's another chart that we have Here, I'm mixing these up here. Here, I'm going to walk you through here, and there's no way that you can read all of this, so I'm going to summarize a few key moments. One is that we see that every time the climate shifts in a massive way, we have some kind of fundamental geohistorical crisis. Most famously, the invasion of so-called barbarian peoples from Central Asia in the 4th century coincides with the worst drought in Central Asia in 2,000 years. The result not of climate, but of how climate and class and civilization all fit together, all configure, is what's at stake here. And so we can see that climate, the civilizations are dependent not only on a certain kind of climate on their way up, but also are almost universally unprepared to deal with it when the climate turns less favorable for the relations of power and production and reproduction that they've set up. So what we have here are a series of epochal crises, one in the Western Roman Empire in the long 5th century, with barbarian invasions, climate change, the end of the Roman climate optimum, and by 535, the onset of the late antique Little Ice Age. In the long 14th century, which is pivotal, and we'll return to that towards the end of this talk, we have, of course, the arrival of the Little Ice Age. Now, it wasn't climate change that did in feudalism, and it was even less some Malthusian crisis, as many environmental historians continue to falsely insist. It was the convergence of class, of the built environments of Western medieval Europe, and climate crisis, all wrapped up in a geohistorical crisis. So it was not climate that did in feudalism, it was class revolt in the cities and the countryside. And then we can see again within capitalism both the crises of the long 17th century and the crisis punctuated by what's called the World Revolution of the West in the late 18th century. The Haitian, American, and French revolutions are closely associated with the Dalton minimum in that period. So we can see that civilization and political instability run together very, very tightly indeed. So one of the important and I think great unasked questions about the history of capitalism, how it's been able to survive, is how was it able to survive two extreme moments of climate change earlier in its history, most notably in the middle of the 17th century, which historians have long called the general crisis of the era. Well, I'm not going to walk you through all of it, but part of the answer is imperialism. So if you could build a global civilization, a transoceanic civilization that knitted together the tropics and the temperate zones, then you would begin to have something really interesting. So this means, yes indeed, that 1492 is still going on. We are still living in the world of Columbus. Long before Descartes, and I think, therefore I am, we had Columbus, I conquer, therefore I am. This was not just a project of violence, although it involved an extraordinary and ongoing amount of violence, but also one directed towards a particular purpose, that is, putting nature to work and reestablishing Pangaea after 175 million years, mobilizing the work and energy of at least 3 continents, or 2.5 if, since Europe isn't really a continent. And this means that we need to understand both the audacious technical and organizational and cultural capacities of Western European empires, bankers, capitalists, slave traders, plantation owners, and others in mobilizing all sorts of natures, including human natures, to work for free or low cost, and to do so through forging a world color line, a world gender line, and at every turn those were linked to a nature civilization binary. Not just ideas floating out in the ether. These are actual, practical, conceptual tools in the hands of empires. So when we want to understand how did capitalism survive in this period, one of the key answers is slavery. No, indeed, capitalism does not owe its existence to property and land, a partial interpretation at best, but property embodies, and the ways in which bodies and colonial landscapes in the form of capitalist sugar plantations, a theme that Joshua Eichen will be talking about later in this conference, that this is absolutely central to these big historical processes. So now we're going to shift around a bit, and we're going to think about capitalism as a system of cheap nature and how we can understand the world color line in that sense. This is, of course, not an exhaustive account. This is simply one situated perspective on capitalism as a historical and multi-species assemblage. So if modern Pangaea was a first step towards a massively fractured, highly unequal, and violently policed global system, its decisive logistical innovation was the European ship. Of these, one was pivotal, the slave ship. For the formation of capitalist agriculture, of the modern proletariat, and modern imperialism relied on the formation of a world color line and the racialization of work that linked two violent abstractions, both binaries, both real material forces, white and not white, civilization and nature. So to make sense of this geohistorical shift, the creation of slave ship Earth, I want us to do a little bit of time traveling. So first, let's return to 1968, 2 years before the first Earth Day, and the year of a world revolution unprecedented in the history of capitalism. That year, a Stanford biologist named Paul Ehrlich published The Population Bomb, and as I noted, it became an all-time environmentalist bestseller. Ehrlich opens Population Bomb with an anecdote of a family trip to Delhi a few years earlier. I don't normally do this, but I'm going to post this passage up here so you can get a sense of it. He writes, "My wife and daughter and I were returning to our hotel in an ancient taxi. The seats were hopping with fleas. As we crawled through the city, we entered a crowded slum area. The temperature was well over 100, and the air was a haze of dust and smoke. The streets seemed alive with people eating, washing, sleeping, visiting, arguing, screaming, people thrusting their hands through the taxi window, begging, people defecating and urinating, people clinging to buses, people hurting animals, people. All of us were," he writes, "frankly frightened. It seemed that anything could happen. I've known ever since that night the feel of overpopulation, the feel of overpopulation." I'm going to let that. So racial anxiety here practically drips off the page. What's striking is that Ehrlich feels overpopulation, not poverty, not the enduring legacy of colonial domination, but too many people. Somehow, all of a sudden, there were just too many people aboard Spaceship Earth, a spacecraft with a limited carrying capacity, in Ehrlich's words. Now, in 1965, somewhere around 2.5 million people lived in Delhi when Ehrlich visited. London, where decisions were made about India's population for nearly 2 centuries, housed 3 times as many people. All right, so that's not an accidental comparison. Britain's rise to world power was intimately connected to India, a once prosperous region that became poor after the bad luck of meeting Englishmen with guns and account books. As recently as 1943, Britain had allowed 3 million Indians to die in a horrific famine while grain surpluses were secured elsewhere in the empire. Faced with offers of food relief from Australia and Canada, Britain demurred. "Not to worry," said Churchill, "the Indians, a beastly people with a beastly religion, breed like rabbits." Churchill came by it honestly. Sorry, where are we? Here we go. Churchill came by it honestly. The 1870s and 1890s had witnessed South Asian famines so deadly that Mike Davis calls them the late Victorian Holocausts. As ever, Britain was taking food out of the subcontinent as millions perished. Population thinking was itself born of imperialism. The 19th century's defining theorist of the population problem was, at the time and of course still today, Thomas Malthus, a fellow Englishman. Malthus was many things, among them an organic intellectual of the British Empire. I don't mean that as a polemic. From 1805, Malthus occupied the first chair in political economy at the East India Company College in Haileybury, where his students called him, I kid you not, Pop, as in population. When a British-imposed famine struck Ireland in the 1840s, it was again an instance of too many people. Whatever Malthus's arguments about population, practically speaking, it's clear that for populationism, overpopulation has always meant too many brown people, or Irish, which for the English was close enough. So let's reflect a moment on the Ehrlich's visit to Delhi in 1965. Ehrlich delivers an intimate account of the feeling of overpopulation: dirty, crowded, poor, hellish. For a long time, as a historian of environmental change and slavery, I couldn't quite put my finger on what Ehrlich's account reminded me of. And then, a couple months ago, it struck me. I want to give you another first-hand description of a hellish reality that parallels Ehrlich's, but for another era, one that began not in the 19th century, but in the long 16th century. The closeness of the place, the heat of the climate, added to the number in the ship, which was so crowded that each had scarcely room to turn himself, almost suffocating us. This produced copious perspirations, so that the air soon became unfit for respiration from a variety of loathsome smells. The wretched situation was again aggravated by the galling of the chains, now become insupportable, and the filth of the necessary tubs of human waste into which the children often fell and were almost suffocated. The shrieks of the women and the groans of the dying rendered the whole scene a horror almost inconceivable. These lines were written by a former slave, Olaudah Equiano, in 1789. His was but one of many gut-wrenching first-hand accounts of the Middle Passage. That's a polite name for the thousands of voyages made by the floating prisons charged with transporting Africans to the New World between the 16th and 19th centuries. We will never know the Middle Passage's precise body count, but somewhere between 1 and 2 million Africans lost their lives on these slave ships. There, see? And these metaphors are very powerful. So we need to have a sense of here we have the formation of the world color line, which of course has been reinvented and restructured, but never abolished ever since. It is fundamental to how capitalism works. Equiano's and Ehrlich's accounts are snapshots taken, of course, by very different people in very different times, places, and situations. But once I read these descriptions side by side, I saw something that I could not unsee. I couldn't help but connect these strikingly similar descriptions to a crucial rift in modern environmental politics. While Ehrlich's vignette was, and often still is, taken as a portrait of overpopulation, accounts such as Equiano's are righteously understood as a portrait of racism at its very worst. Ehrlich's metaphorical spaceship Earth bursting with too many people, and Equiano's actually existing slave ships have rarely passed each other over the past half-century. So when I started to look into this, of course, the slave ships were floating prisons for a good reason, not just that the people were captive, but every ship was constantly on guard and was militarized and organized and prepared at every moment of the voyage against the most fearsome, the greatest threat they could imagine, the slave ship revolt. We have nearly 500 recorded slave ship revolts, probably 5 times as many. That is, perhaps as many as 1 in 10 slave ships experience a revolt. So this gives us a very different metaphor for understanding the world around us. So imagine with me an absurd parable. Paul Ehrlich, upon time traveling to the middle of the 18th century, visits a slave ship. He's horrified. The experience makes a deep impression on him, and he commits to telling the world of a terrifying reality, the dirty, filthy, oppressive, impoverished, and hellish problems of the slave ships. Designed to carry no more than 100 people, they are instead carrying 3 times that number. The slave ships are overpopulated. We must therefore commit to reducing the numbers on these slave ships, a move that will ameliorate the overcrowded and unsanitary conditions that plague these vessels. There's an absurd thought experiment, but not an unreasonable one. Announcing that the problem with slave ships is their carrying capacity rather than a toxic stew of imperialism, racism, and capital accumulation is not very different from announcing that India's problem in 1965 was overpopulation. Spaceship Earth offered a more subtle version of the white supremacy inscribed in the conservationism and preservationism of the early 20th century, but not by much. And today's Anthropocene conversation is its direct descendant. The popular Anthropocene is Spaceship Earth for an era of market triumphalism, resurgent white supremacism, and the techno-utopianism of the billionaire class. Now, like any significant cultural turn, the post-1968 language of environmentalism grappled with planetary realities in ways that offered space for radical critique. Of course, figures like Barry Commoner, Murray Bookchin, and others prefigured the red-green politics and scholarship that matured in the 1990s. The dominant thrust of modern environmentalism, however, was not radical at all. The post-1968 environmental imaginary, Spaceship Earth, Blue Marble, was a new and persuasive cultural form of anti-communist containment. Spaceship Earth and populationism, then as now, constituted an effective form of geocultural counterinsurgency. Its worldviews and discourses stress the fundamental unity of humans in facing the global environmental crisis, always defined in scattershot fashion before the full reality of climate crisis was recognized. That fundamental unity stressed the need for a common human project, laudable enough. In the same breath, it erased the durable histories of genocide, racism, sexism, and exploitation, all folded into a convenient shorthand. We, humanity, industrial man, you name it. So if we are going to come to grips with planetary crisis and to forge a politics of climate and planetary justice, we need to be able to understand we are facing a singular crisis with multiple forms. Two of the major ones are the crisis of life-making, quite powerful, quite real, and the crisis of profit-making. I think that it's crucial to name the system. I think that that's long been the strength of liberation movements everywhere, to not be content with the language of the oppressors. We need to insist that climate change is not anthropogenic. Climate change is capitalogenic. We need to remind our comrades and our audiences and our citizens that humanity is a real abstraction, not a wonderful kumbaya moment for us all to gather around the campfire. That humanity in historical terms has been an instrument of practical racism, sexism, and imperialism. So the Capitalocene alternative argues that world ecology is about how power, production, and reproduction fit together in the web of life, in which capital and empire make environments, and environments make capital and empire. So we move from the environment to environment making. And humans are not the only environmental making species. I think we need to insist that the Capitalocene is about planetary apartheid from 1492 and about planetary patriarchy from the same period. That the Capitalocene is about not one, but many forms of work. This is absolutely crucial, both to challenge the formalist Marxism and mainstream environmental programs. So, what's ahead, of course, will depend on how well working people of every kind can imagine a radical politics that does two things, at least two things. One, grasps capitalism's long history of racist, sexist, and colonial domination as fundamental to the exploitation of working classes and endless capital accumulation. And two, which comprehends the relation of human and extra-human natures as a moment in which an injury to one is indeed an injury to all. I realize that is a tall order, but I think one way forward is to imagine the climate crisis as something more than purely biophysical to which we add on social problems, but rather to see it as a geohistorical moment that reveals webs of power, life, production, and reproduction as fundamentally entangled. So as we close this out, I would make two observations on the present historical conjuncture of the 21st century. First, and I'll remind you of the pretty climate history chart that we saw earlier. It will come back. Climate change is always destabilizing for ruling classes. So all this talk about how the rich are going to be able to protect themselves from climate change, sometimes yes, over a matter of months and years. Over the matter of decades, no, not at all. And so here I'm just going to remind you of just how big a deal climate shifts always are for ruling classes. Now earlier I reminded all of you that the Little Ice Age that began right around 1290 in Northern Europe didn't bring down feudalism. Overpopulation didn't bring down feudalism. Class revolt brought down feudalism. Class revolt made it impossible for Europe's royal and seigneurial elites to restore feudalism. That's why ultimately we get Columbus and the Columbian invasion and the invasion of the Americas. Now, my second observation is, and this will be contentious, but I think it's worth debating. The dynamics of climate change are favoring new revolutionary alignments between environmental justice, feminist, anti-racist, labor, food sovereignty, and other movements. I think that they are revealing that capitalism's model of putting nature to work is increasingly exhausted, and in doing so, the climate justice movement reveals the possibilities for new valuations and new visions of life and justice, work, and play. And so here I'm going to remind you of our tripartite division of work up here in the upper left-hand corner, that may give us some, not just some nice words to say, but some analytical insights into how we might begin, and indeed the movements, we can think of Blockadia, we can think of indigenous-led movements against extractivism, are showing some of the in the Americas are showing some of the possibilities of this, that we have this tripartite division of work, of the unpaid work of humans, overwhelmingly of women, overwhelmingly racialized. We have the paid work of proletarian labor and the money economy, and we have the unpaid work of nature as a whole. So recognizing this tripartite division of work gives us the opportunity to imagine a new revolutionary politics of planetary justice. So we need to do at least two things, and this is going to simplify, one about work and one about nature, and we need to turn them inside out and put them in dialogue with each other. Reimagining work in capitalism beyond a labor fundamentalism provides a way forward into this unpleasant reality. A revolutionary politics of work that cannot address the problems of care work and social reproduction will surely fail. So too, a radical labor politics unable to address the crisis of the biosphere. Similarly, a revolutionary politics of nature that cannot speak to the questions of precarious and dangerous work, of surplus humanity, of racialized, gendered, and sexualized violence will be doomed to failure. So the time has come, and I think we are here today and over the next few days to do this, for a conversation about how to forge a radical vision that takes as its premise the organic whole of life and biosphere, production and reproduction. And I want to suggest this is a question to carry with us. What stories do we need to find our way through the present planetary state shift, this abrupt and irreversible transformation in the conditions of the web of life? It seems to me that such stories will need as touchstones the care, compassion, and connection that is so deeply lacking in today's world. And how do we act and think and love and organize our way through this state shift? Well, central to world ecology has been the argument that we need to think, work, and nurture in new ways, especially through an ethic of care for humans, for the web of life, and for the multi-species interdependencies that make the good life possible. That means putting nature at the center of our thinking about work, putting work at the center of our thinking about nature, and setting aside the presumption that human organizations of any kind, from transnational corporations and financial markets to the family, can be adequately understood, abstracted from the rest of nature. From these intellectual, but always more than intellectual ruptures, we may find ways forward, I hope, to converse and cultivate and care for new ecologies of hope and justice in the 21st century. Thank you very much.
Thanks. I also want to thank everybody that has made this possible. I think it's going to be an intriguing set of dates articulated through ecologies of hope. That was a great ending. I vacillated for my title. And the title that I settled for was Stories from the Anthropo-not-seen, or Sharing Interests in Common that Are Not the Same Interest. And here it is. I am going to start in 2009 in the Amazonian region of Peru. On June 2009, at dawn, and near the northern Amazonian town of Bawa, a violent confrontation took place between police forces and a large group of Peruvian citizens self-identified as belonging to the Awajún Wampis indigenous group. Explaining this event, the narrative that circulates in the media goes more or less as follows. As part of a general strike, which started on April 9th, that same year, 2009, and was organized by several Amazonian indigenous groups, the Awajún Wampis had taken control of a highway in northern Peru at a place called La Curva del Diablo, the Devil's Curve. They were protesting several decrees with which the government conceded their territory to corporate oil exploration without abiding by the ILO Agreement 169. This international legislation, as you know, to which the Peruvian government has officially adhered, requires signatory states to consent the inhabitants of territories that corporations may request for exploration and exploitation. Not having consulted with them, the concession was illegal, the protesters said. The police's objective was to break up the highway blockade, but given unknown circumstances that are still under investigation, the confrontation got out of control. According to official count, the clash, known as El Baguazo, in English, the huge event in Bawa, yielded more than 30 deaths between Awahun Wampis and policemen. The state ordered the arrest of several indigenous leaders. They were recently acquitted, like last year, after spending 8 years in prison. Among those was Santiago Manuin Valera, the most public Awahun Wampis individual. The quote on the slide is part of his testimony during the trial in April 2014, 5 years after the event. At the time, he faced life in prison. We will never accept that the government does what it wants with the territory that our ancestors assigned us before the Peruvian state was formed. Peru and the whole world should know that this place of 30,000 kilometers is ours and belongs to us. We will always defend it and will give our lives for it. We, the Awahun Wampis, were defending our right, our identity, our culture, a development of our own, our forests, our rivers, our cosmos, and our territory. Santiago Manuin ended the statement declaring his innocence. The criminal trial against Manuin and others may be interpreted as a conflict over sovereignty, and depending on where we stand, we can debate for the right of the Awahun Wampis to defend their territory, or side with the state's prerogative to decide over national territory and the use of natural resources. Taken to the court, these would already be a challenging legal problem. However, I intend to argue that at the inception of the conflict is a disagreement that would not find resolution within the rule of law, even in its fairest version, for it exceeds the domain of law as it exists. Explaining the confrontation in the midst of the strike, Lenny, a young Awahun Wampis leader, his face painted in red and black, a bandana around his head, spoke these words. We speak of our brothers who quench our thirst, who bathe us, those who protect our needs. This brother is what we call the river. We do not use the river for a sewage. A brother cannot stop another brother. We do not stop our brothers. If the transnational corporations would care about our soil like we have cared for it for millennia, we would gladly give them room so that they could work here. But all they care is their economic benefit, to fill their coffers with wealth. With Lenny's words, I want to suggest that in this statement, in Santiago Manuin's statement that you're reading, territory may make reference both to a piece of land under the jurisdiction of the Peruvian state and to an entity that emerges through the practices of life of Awahun Wampis that may, for example, make people relatives of rivers, as in Lenny's statement. And kinship between people and water and forest may transform territory into Awahun Wampis, as in a recent public declaration by the leaders who said, territory is the Awahun Wampis. This relation, where people and territory are together, exceeds the possibilities of modern humans and modern nature, as well as modern relations between them, without precluding them. This is important. These relations, where Awahun Wampis are territory, where rivers are not only rivers, do not preclude modern relations between humans and nature. And this will become clearer later. It also complicates the conflict between the state and the Awahun Wampis. Rather than an abuse of power that can be unmade, if with difficulty, of course, the conflict becomes a misunderstanding impossible to solve without engaging in the terms that make territory other to the state's ability to understand and therefore to its recognition. Erupting publicly, the conflict poses a challenge intolerable to the state, and its response might be the eradication of its roots, the denial of the Awahun Wampis terms to exist. Thus viewed, the conflict is ontological. I draw on Jacques Rancière and Eduardo Viveiros de Castro to conceptualize it as a confrontation housing a historical disagreement, that's Rancière's term, about an equivocation, that's Viveiros de Castro's term, over what territory is and the relations that make it. I think that both Rancière and Viveiros de Castro would disagree about the conversation that I am putting them into. Eduardo Viveiros de Castro is a Brazilian anthropologist. Equivocation is his concept to explain the mode of communication among Amerindian inhabitants, humans and not, in the Brazilian Amazon. Equivocation, he says, houses the referential alterity between homonymic concepts, with which entities that populate Amerindian worlds communicate or translate among each other. Crucial to the concept is first that these entities, which we would regard as humans or animals, consider themselves humans and see their others as animals. And second, that what is results from the entity's point of view, which in turn results from their body. Communication and even preserving one's life consists in controlling the equivocation, or understanding that while the concept and therefore the understanding of the thing it refers to may be shared, the thing itself may emerge as different if the concept is uttered by an other to the self in the interlocution. When equivocation is a mode of communication, concepts and things are partially connected only. The same word may refer to two different things depending on the world it is uttered from. In the case that concerns me here, territory may be both the piece of land that rests separate from the humans and the state that may have the right to it, or the entity that is with the Awahun Wampis. What territory is would depend on the world that pronounces it, the relations that it emerges from. This agreement may have the appearance of an equivocation. Rancière, a philosopher of politics and aesthetics, conceptualizes this agreement as the conflict between one who says white and another who also says white but does not understand the same thing by it. Yet, while equivocation assumes that all parts in the interlocution are speakers and thus can name things that are conceptually the same and objectively different, the misunderstanding that provokes disagreement, a la Rancière, results from, quote, a contention over what speaking means. It is both, quote, a dispute over the object of the discussion and over the capacity of those who are making an object of it. As a political interruption to alter the conventional order and establish equality, this agreement is a dispute that confronts those who have speech with those that do not have or are denied speech. It is a dispute about the conventions that distribute capacities to define what is and how that is. Thus, the difference between both fellow concepts. Equivocation is a relation of misunderstanding between equals that are mutually other. The root of the misunderstanding is ontological, and while it can be controlled, it is also an inevitable relational condition that cannot be changed. Instead, disagreement pits unequals in a dispute to be the same, and thus name and define what the same should be. Here, the misunderstanding reflects an epistemic dispute to change how the established order is perceived. Said differently, and perhaps more clearly in terms of the argument that I'm trying to make here, conceptualized through equivocation, the misunderstanding is because the same concept houses entities as they are in worlds that are not the same world, or not only the same world. Instead, this agreement conceptualizes misunderstandings as emerging from a dispute about the distribution of conditions enabling individuals to name entities existing in a shared world. Thinking through Rancière's notion of disagreement, the big event in Bawa can be rendered as the eruption of politics, a historical event in which a subject emerges that disrupts the distribution of speech and the order it creates. In the specific case of El Bawaso, the disagreement that the Awahun Wampis manifested would have interrupted the distribution of the speech that assigns the state sovereignty to decide over territory. Against it, the Awahun Wampis would have claimed their own sovereign voice. Understood as an extension of the country over which humans have the power of decision, the entity territory remains the same. What and how it is would not be in dispute. The dispute would be about who has the right over it. Instead, conceptualized as a disagreement that houses an equivocation, the conflict can also be interpreted as a dispute around an entity, territory, that's not the same, and cannot be the different things that it may emerge as in interlocutions between Awahun Wampis and the state. Thinking through territory as equivocation, Santiago Manuin's statements and the trial from where they emerge would also reflect a disagreement, the nature of which is ontological. Thus, the equivocation would also be a political dispute aggravated by the condition of its impossibility, for neither the state nor the law are able, let alone equipped, to recognize the equivocation or the political dispute around it. I am calling this condition the Anthropo-not-seen. I conceptualize it as a world-making process through which heterogeneous worlds that do not make themselves through the ontological practices that separate between humans or culture and non-humans or nature, nor necessarily conceive as such the different entities in their assemblages, are both obliged into that distinction and exceeded. The Anthropo-not-seen would thus be both the will that obliges the distinction and destroys what disobeys the obligation, and the excesses to that will. The Anthropocene has become popular as a scholarly reference to the era when humans have become a geological force capable of planetary destruction. The Anthropo-not-seen makes obvious reference to the term, and the suffix is intended as a pun to its counterpart, seen. However, the not seen does not necessarily refer to the theme of visibility. Rather, it makes ontological reference to what is within a historically formulated condition of impossibility. I'm going to repeat that. What is, it makes reference to what is within a historically condition of impossibility. Hence, included in the Anthropo-not-seen are antagonistic partners and their antagonistic relationships. On the one hand, the Anthropo-not-seen comprises the practices and practitioners of the will that granted itself the power to eradicate all that disobeyed mandates to be human as modernity in its early and late versions sanction. On the other, it includes the disobedient practitioners of collectives composed with entities recalcitrant to classification and individuation as either human or non-human. As an organized process of destruction, sometimes through benevolently offered assimilation, the Anthropo-not-seen as relation was, and sometimes continues to be, a silent war gauged against entities and world-making practices that ignore the separation of entities into nature and culture. Dating from the 16th century in what became the Americas, the war was initially loud and clear. Fighting for their God, Christian clerics walked the Andes from Colombia to Argentina, extirpating idolatries, a political practice that the friars conceived against devil-induced worship. Extirpation required dividing the participating entities into God-made nature, mountains, rivers, forests, and naturales, incipient humans who nevertheless had a soul in need of salvation. The invention of modern politics secularized the antagonism. The war against recalcitrance to distinguish nature from humanity was silenced. Yet it continued in the name of progress and against backwardness, the evil that replaced the devil. Conceived with hegemonic vocation, war practices included forms of making live. Inferior humans became the object of benevolent and inevitable inclusion, enemies that did not even count as such. The war was and continues to be waged through silent means. Yet, when collectives against whom the war is waged demand politics, that is, when the disagreement around equivocations becomes public and collectives press for recognition of that which the state cannot recognize, the silent war may translate into overt battle, like in the case of the Awahun Wampis. The state allegedly waged it in the name of the common good. Disobedient collectives responded to defend their survival. Extractivism is a concept that circulates profusely in Latin America and that quite literally makes the Capitalocene or Anthropocene materially present in the region as a human geological force, while at the same time foregrounding its articulation through financial capital and in connection with infrastructural development and growth. Currently used in environmental circles in the region, critical contributors to the term trace extractivist practices back to Spanish colonial mining. The extraction of silver from the Cerro Rico de Potosí in Huancavelica, currently in Peru and Bolivia, are infamous examples of death and destruction caused by the extraction of minerals for circulation in Iberian metropolitan markets. Many features make extractivism a different venture compared to the earlier also extractive practices. Some obvious ones are the corporate character of the practice, the worldwide ubiquity of the model and its interconnectedness, the unprecedented rate of expansion of markets for minerals, oil, and energy, and the magnitude of new technologies that allow for the quick and profitable extraction of natural resources. For example, former tunnel mining that was in the previous slide, the perforation of mountains following the vein of minerals, has been replaced by open pits that destroy mountains, creating crater-like formations that extend over hundreds of hectares and reach depths of more than 1,000 meters. And the magnitude of so-called environmental impact is also unprecedented. As an illustration, between the years 2006 and 2011, Bolivia produced 5,500 tons of silver that required the removal of more than 44 million tons of rocks. Removing the rocks from where they were and dumping them destroys. As of 2014, 51% of indigenous lands in Peru had been offered to mining and oil corporations. And this is up to 2014. I don't have recent numbers. Moved by a well-funded race for progress and promoted by economic growth, the reach of the current destruction of indigenous worlds is historically unparalleled, and news about it is not precisely scarce. No effort needs to be displayed to learn about appalling incidents at any given time. Consider this commentary published not long ago that narrates that slow death of the Wayuu, an indigenous group in Colombia, at the hands of a huge coal mine. And I'm going to read briefly from the slide. Everything has been taken away from them. This is a mainstream journal. Everything has been taken away from them. They have stolen their land, their water, even their names, and the spoliation continues. The drought that burns them with thirst is neither nature's whim nor a consequence of global warming. It is that the great coal company from El Cerrejón built the dam El Cercado, which the state inaugurated with great publicity, and it sucked the water for the needs of the immense mine. Denunciations like this one find the public beyond the indigenous peoples whose life is at stake, and among those more generally concerned with the distribution of ecological conflicts and human rights. Extractivism has met a relentless opposition that articulates unexpected alliances across the heterogeneous demands of a vast array of collectives. Politically relevant, they have a capacity to attract public attention against human rights violations and corporate ecological amputations. At the same time, performed through modern notions, environment, rights, biodiversity, the reality-making practices of the alliances continue the Anthropocene, the Anthropo-not-seen, The alliances continue the Anthropo-not-seen. Yet, these same alliances that continue the Anthropo-not-seen are complex. Inspecting them with heart and mind open to surprise, we may find that they deserve care. Defending themselves, the spokespersons of worlds experiencing destruction at the hands of extractivism have revealed their practices through television stations and newspapers. They have shared that nature or the environment, which are the matter of public concern, are not only such. Revelations of unimaginable beings and their destruction can be as ubiquitous as the war against those who oppose what the state considers as its mission to provide for the common good. Just as the Anthropo-not-seen, as the destruction of worlds, acquired a might and speed that early extirpators of idolatries would envy, from the side of the Anthropo-not-seen, as the side of worlds that reject their destruction, emerge stories that may bring into existence a public that does not yet exist. Us as a public that does not yet exist, but hopefully it will. Thus, even if what becomes public is a translation into environmental and human rights concerns, the denunciations and the alliances that make them possible offer a possibility for onto-epistemic openings that deserves attention. Analogous to the Awahun Wampi's claim that their kinship with the forest makes them their territory, in a dispute about petroleum extraction in a site called Vaca Muerta in Argentina, a Mapuche group wrote in a communique, "Our territories are not resources, but lives that make the ixofimogen of which we are part, not its owners." Contrastingly, this is how Vaca Muerta is defined by developers from Neuquén, one of the provinces where the hydrocarbons deposits are located. Vaca Muerta is an immense páramo, a desert that extends beyond what the eyes can see. It is a hostile territory that shelters enough energy to make Argentina self-sufficient and even export gas and oil to the world. The stark contrast suggests that the public dispute is not only about petroleum extraction. The Mapuche Declaration asserts the inherent irrationality between the entities that compose ixofimogen, which therefore cannot be easily divided into territory and the resources extracted from it. What the oil company enacts as nature and humans, the Mapuche enact not only as such. Their interruption Their interruption of this hegemonic partition of the sensible is a political worlding event that is also conceptual. It performs an ontological opening emergent from which are humans with what we call nature. This condition, which is not a mix of humans and nature, makes each of the other more than just one of them. It makes humans more than humans because it makes them with nature, and it makes nature more than nature because it makes them with humans. An example from my own work in the Andes of Cusco. Runacuna, the local Quechua word for people, with Tiracuna, entities that are also yet not only mountains, take place together. And when I say take place, I'm talking about them occurring together, happening together, taking place together. In contrast, the relation between modern humans and mountains makes them distinct from each other, separates them and makes them distinct from each other. Runacuna with earth beings are, of course, not a requirement of the processes that have emerged to question the universal quality of the partition of the sensible into nature and humans. Here is another example. In the northern Andes of Peru, a mining corporation wants to drain several lagoons to extract copper and gold from some and to discard mineral waste in others. In exchange, reservoirs with water capacity several times that of the lagoons would be built. That's the offer of the corporation. Opposing the plan, environmentalists argue that the reservoirs will destroy the ecosystem of which the lagoons are part, a landscape made of agricultural land, high-altitude wetlands, cattle, humans, trees, crops, creeks, and springs. The local population adds that the lagoons are local life. Their plants, animals, soils, trees, families are with that specific water, which cannot be translated into water from reservoirs, not even if, as the mining corporation promises, they would provide more water than the lagoons. It would not be the same water which they defend, organized as guardians of the lagoons. People have died in this defense, making public another instance of the war against those who oppose translation as nature into resources. Yet, in no case have the guardians of the lagoons said that the water is a being. It is local water, as such intranslatable into H2O, therefore not to be used for a general national common good. Rather, transpiring through local bodies, it emerges as uncommon nature, and placing being, including the being of mountains and, of course, water. An iconic guardian of the lagoons is a peasant woman whose plots the corporate mining project wants to buy to fully legalize its access to the territories it plans to excavate. The woman, whose name is Maxima, refuses to sell, and probably for an amount of money that she would otherwise never see in her lifetime. Countless times, the national police, hired by the mine, has destroyed the family's crops, attacked her and her children, even her animals. Also hired by the mine, several judiciary courts have ruled against the woman. The woman's plots have been under siege for more than 5 years now. I fight to protect the lagoon has been one of her responses, and asserting attachment to place, she adds, I'm not going to stop. They will disappear me, but I'll die here. Through the lens of modern politics and using the grammar that separates humans and universal nature, this woman can be interpreted as an environmentalist and thus an enemy or an ally, depending on who speaks. Drove to exasperation, supporters of the reservoirs figure her as a cunning manipulator awaiting a better price for her plot. To those on the other side of the political spectrum, she's a hero willing to sacrifice herself to prevent ecological damage. In the language of both detractors and supporters, she's a subject in relation to an object, and thus perfectly grammatical as she acts in response to conditions imposed on her. However, the refusal to sell may include another relation. one from a woman, land, lagoon, or plants, rocks, soils, animals, lagoons, humans, creeks, canal, emerge inherently together, an entanglement of entities needy of each other in such a way that pulling any one apart would transform it into something else. Conceived through this relation, the refusal to sell may also imply the refusal of the grammar that transforms entities into individual bodies, units of nature or the environment, which, as part of each other, these entities are not. Maxima's refusal would enact a local ecologized nature, where entities are interdependent on each other, and that simultaneously coincides with, differs from, and exceeds, also because it includes humans, the object that the state, the mining corporation, and the environmentalists translate into resources to be exploited or to be defended. Carving out an unusual form of relation, Maxima also makes herself agrammatical to the subject-object relation that the state and capital need to respectively recognize and appropriate. Maximas may be a response that exceeds any known or expected logic, for example, that of profit and gain, and also that of the environment and its defense. If she is an environmentalist, and I think she is not only such. Defending herself and going beyond herself, she declares her stewardship of lagoons and all that their waters allow, and she does that in more than one way. She confronts the mine, arguing her property of the land. She confronts the mine, arguing her property of the land. She even shows the legal document that proves her ownership. However, when Maxima explains her being with the land in impossible detachment, their being together through and with crops, rain, soil, animals, entities that make are the relation, this explanation, I propose, exceeds the limit of the property concept, where she nevertheless meets the mind in confrontation. She stays because staying she is. The redundancy reveals the relation that both place and Maxima emerge from. One where she's not subject of the land, which is not her object. Her responses, as I asked why she stayed, why can I be if I'm not this? And the word place is not uttered. Instead, feet are stomped. This is who I am. How can I go? I will die. The word here is not uttered. Who I am, and with my bones I will be. Once again, here is not uttered, like I am now. Of course, we can listen to her words through a habitual subject and object grammar, but the need for the brackets also suggests that there's not only one grammar to her refusal to sell the land the mine wants. Not only is a frequent phrase in our analysis. I learned to give it conceptual status from conversations with Mariano Turpo, the friend with whom I collaborated the ideas that came into my recent book. A Quechua speaker and a commuter across some of the worlds that make our country, Peru, he would insist that what to me was, for example, a mountain, was not only that. And grasping what was not only what emerged through my habitual practice of thought, in addition to taking time, required learning to work at a permanent interface where Mariano's world in practices and mine were both seemingly alike and also different. Drawing from this ethnographic conceptual experience, I propose to think Maxima's refusal to live both through the notion of property and its relations, and through what may be not only property and the relations that may emerge to make her with those she is. Let me explain. Concepts do work in an ecology. Accordingly, they perform with the concepts they find themselves in the company of. Thus, when Maxima practices her refusal to leave, property may emerge as a concept multiple, as she switches from becoming with land to legally defending herself vis-a-vis the corporation's attempt to evict her. What I'm proposing is that she moves from property, as the mind would understand it, in an attachment to land that exceeds the notion of property. The first conceptual practice, becoming with land, exceeds the legal notion of property and emerges at its limits when the legal concept of property is not anymore. Refusing to leave may be motivated simultaneously by both an environmentalist-inspired rejection to the mind's desire to destroy lagoons. It may also be a practice that defies commensuration. It renders land unoccupiable by the market, for it is integrally occupied by and occupying the woman that will not leave. Maxima's stories, like those of the Mapuches, the Wahun Wampis, and Andean Runacuna, are stories from the Anthropo-not-seen. While they seemingly occur everywhere, the events are local, and if told attending to place, the narratives may expose complexities that unsettle usual analytical grammars and push concepts to their limits. Listening with care, these stories could suggest that the conflicts they narrate may include a disagreement that may not find resolution, for it exceeds the existing domain of the rule of law, namely the conception and regulation of nature as resources. Conceding rather than denying the possibility of excess may open thought and feeling to that which is not only what to our common senses is. The requirement for this opening may be a disposition to give equivocation a chance. This means cultivating a disposition to consider that what is hegemonically, for example, nature, to continue with the same theme, may also be other than nature, even if it occupies the same space. Not only a river, also a person. Not only universal water, also local water. Not only mountains, also earth beings. Not only land, also exophimogen. And thus, I conclude this intervention with a speculation about the possibility of a political alliance that accepts the chance of equivocation, alliances not across different viewpoints about the same world, but alliances made considering that the viewpoints may correspond to worlds that are not only the same. And there is an empirical case backing my speculation. I draw it from the Guardians of the Lagoon. Confronted with the mining corporation's proposal to desiccate the lagoons, a heterogeneous network of environmentalists has backed the local guardians against the mining corporation. The cartoon I include here manifests the alliance. Its author mocks the corporation's efforts to convince a peasant family who, confronted with a choice of finite money and long-lasting land, rationally uses an economic benefit logic and chooses the land. This seemingly mirrors Maxima's decision. Yet the cartoon simplifies the alliance. For example, differing with the cartoonist's opinion, the economic security of her family may not figure as definitely in Maxima's refusal to sell. Yet both the cartoonist and Maxima converge in the idea of not selling. Similarly, the interests environmentalists and the guardians of the lagoons share to defend nature or the environment may be not only the same interest. The locally ecologized nature of the guardians and the biological defined nature of environmental activists may indeed exceed each other. In both cases, however, the possibility exists for a coincidence that rather than identical interest would be underpinned by uncommonalities, interests in common that are not the same interest. Occupying a space that is the same, yet cannot be mapped in terms of a single set of three-dimensional coordinates, complexly heterogeneous forms, universal nature, the environment, water that resists translation to H2O, land that is object and non, entities that I'm calling ecologized nature or nature recalcitrant to universality, converge in an alliance that, along with coincidences, may include the parties' constitutive divergence. They converge in the alliance without becoming the same. A condition that would alter politics as usual, this alliance would also house hope for a commons that does not require the division between universal nature and diversified humans. A commons constantly emerging from the uncommons as ground for political negotiation of what the interest in common, and thus the commons, would be. A commons that cannot be without uncommons. Instead of the expression of shared relations and stewardship of nature, these commons would be the expression of a worlding of many worlds ecologically related across their constitutive divergence. Here I've used the word divergence, a notion of divergence, which I borrow from Isabel Stengers, and she defines it as a coming together of heterogeneous practices that will remain different, that will remain heterogeneous, yet self-difference. In the coming together, they do not need to become what the other is. Another way in which I use divergence is to think about Ausangate as an entity housing more than one entity that diverge from each other. Extractivism is a trope through which the Capitalocene makes itself present in Latin America, and like at a planetary scale, it threatens to destroy even what makes it possible. Paradoxically, this destructive ruthlessness has made public collectives for whom nature may be not only such, and who oppose destructivist destruction of who they are, and not only nature, in novel alliances with environmentalists for whom nature may be only nature. Seen through extractivism, the Anthropocene or Capitalocene may be a historical moment of implosion, when the war against disobedient worlding practices turned against the world that waged it. Defending themselves from the destruction that currently threatens them, the collectives that exceed the divides between human and not human have become visible, manifesting their excess. Against the not-seen war, their excess erupts publicly in resistance, asserting their being and demanding politics beyond the cultural rights the state might or may not grant them. A far cry from being a conflict as usual, their disagreement with the state may be about sovereignty and not only. It may express the public demand to allow in politics conditions of no nature, no culture that Merlin Strathern conceptualized years ago and that have historically been denied existence. The silence that cloaked the war against disobedient worlding practices may be coming to an end. The destruction and the fight against it can be ubiquitously seen on all types of screens. Paradoxically, the era of the Anthropocene may witness the historical end of the not seen. This last slide is Maxima with unusual allies. Former candidate for president who lost and doesn't want to run because state power may not be what she wants, and the guy who was his vice president. So that's it. Oh, we sit here, right?
That was great. No, you can stay there.
Do you want me to sit there? Yeah. We can sit down. If you have something, we could maybe take 5 guest lists first, and then, yeah, please.
That was great.
I have a lot of points in color. I'll tell you about it.
Maybe just speak loud.
I want to thank the 2 professors for the
Okay. I want to once again thank the 2 professors for their beautiful presentation of their papers. However, I have a few questions for them. First of all, I want to address the paper of Professor Moore. I listened to your paper very, very meticulously, and I say the narrative of history as to how the West affected the rest, in which you're talking of the third world especially. And I'm asking this question not because I'm African, but because I'm human. The question I want to throw to you is that in all you have said and demonstrated to us by all these pictures and graphics, what constitutes your own personal take in terms of how you want to address or readdress history, especially the history of the disastrous British policy in India and the history of the slave trade? I ask this question because in most European textbooks, people like Christopher Columbus and other criminal bands that came to South America to prospect for gold and other economic gains, dealt ruthlessly with the local population. Literally, we read in history that the Indians and other indigenous people were literally, dealt with in such a way that many of them were wiped out. And some could claim ignorant that they didn't know it was wrong. Like somebody who said in a court in Brazil that he didn't know it was wrong to kill an Indian when he was taken to court. Having said that, what is your own personal take as to how you want this issue to be addressed in terms of maybe there is need for reparation to compensate those that were affected, or how that can be addressed? I remember in 1998, the president of the International Sociological Association, Professor Immanuel Wallerstein, in his presidential address, which he titled "The West and the Rest." And in this short, just a one-page address, but you can write 1,000 pages from that particular address. He identified the key problem between the West and the rest, especially the issue of Eurocentrism, Western centrism, Afrocentrism, Sinocentrism, Japanocentrism, and so on and so forth. And he believed that as long as this debates continue on this divide, there cannot be progress, especially for those that have been disadvantaged in this aspect. So please, I want you to enlighten us. Especially, you come from America, where the bulk of the slaves that were taken from Africa were exported to.
Please, could you shorten up? We only have 10 minutes for questions.
Okay, so please, I want you to address that, because even upon the freedom of the slave in America, they were just left without any form of empowerment in terms of land ownership and so on and so forth. So they have to start from the crash. And so that's one of the reasons why in America, the blacks remain at the lower level of the pecking order, so to say. So that is the question. So, and again, there are issues between the West and the rest, like the contradiction of the Western policy in the third world. And today, the West is facing some of these backlash of these contradictions, like some of the wars that are happening in some parts of the third world, like Syria, Iraq, and other places. How will the Europeans deal with the influx of refugees into this part of the world?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. We can return later to this, but now we have to give space for others also. Please.
Other questions?
Yeah, the lady there. In the left, there. Yeah.
There was someone.
Blue shirt, far left.
Yeah, here,
Far
please.
left, you're right.
Well, you can ask first, please, here. But
Jason, you were so inspiring and so provocative. Marisol, you were so deep and so moving. And with regard to the life of the people in the Andean mountains, there is a looming, overwhelming tragedy. If deforestation continues in the Amazonian basin in Brazil, the rains will no longer arrive in the Andean mountains. Now there is water because of the melting of the snow caps. That will soon end. After that, if deforestation in Brazil continues, the lagoons will be gone in the mountains because there won't be any rain. And we need a concerted global action in that regard, in my opinion. And I'm sure you are aware of this. And what is your advice?
There's another one here.
Yeah.
I have a question to Professor Moore. First of all, thank you very much for the very inspiring presentation. In the very end of it, you emphasized some very important points regarding planetary justice. So I was wondering whether it's possible to avoid the risks of abstractionism while we are arguing for planetary justice, namely to avoid arguing for planetary justice as a homogeneous concept, and instead of it to focus on the complex relations between intra and intergenerational justice. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks very much. I came a bit late, so I don't know the introduction. I know, of course, Professor Moore.
Marisol.
All right. Could you please explain to me, I mean, you mentioned the silver excavation in Bolivia, which is about 55,000 tons against almost millions of tons of rock that were destroyed. Could you explain to me in more detail what the Bolivians, for example, or the international community is doing in relation to such type of massive destruction? Yeah.
I can, it's sad.
Okay, one more maybe, or should... Okay, let's answer these because we don't have any more questions now. Please. Or do we have? Yeah, one more.
Hello, also, thank you very much for both speeches. I come from Greece, and obviously this is the ultimate new territory of extractivist policies, and it is a place of crisis that is not a far remote place that we normally link with indigenous or other kind of situations that would help starting from below upwards. And it's in the center of the Western imaginary, and it is also in the center of what now could be the next step, and is not. So I'm very interested on what could be these new policies in terms of what you're saying that could be applied in the center of the problem that somehow describes the next day in extractivist policies within crisis.
So is this a question about how does Greece escape the stranglehold of German-dominated European capital? Okay.
Please, Jason or Marisol, who wants to start?
I can start. You didn't address your question to me, but yeah, but I think that your question is pertinent and it's huge. When I say that the Anthropocene may be a point of implosion of when I say that the moment of the Anthropocene may be a moment of implosion of the system that made it, I am also thinking about the way in which the event that we are currently living through may oblige us, or should oblige us. We should all feel obliged to inherit the previous history in a different way, which includes thinking of history differently. And that is a task that pertains to us all, not just to those that are thinking about the current moment. It pertains to us all. And one of the things that in my work I do to inherit the moment, the event of the Anthropocene, the Capitalocene, Thulocene, or the not seen differently is precisely by opening it up to what the dominant habit of thought, the hegemonic habit of thought, prevents us from thinking. Slowing down reasoning and thinking in a different way. In terms of your question, that was the only one addressed to me directly about what Bolivia is doing. Bolivia is doing deep extractivism. As Evo Morales arrived in power, Morales and Garcia Linera felt the obligation to make economic growth for the common good. So it is doing development and economic growth and implementing possibly socialist capitalocene. And in terms of the Greek condition, the Greek conundrum, one of the things that I regret about my work is that it started with indigeneity. But Maxima cannot claim indigeneity. Maxima is offering an example that we could all think about practicing, making oneself with place, and deoccupying land as commodity, making it you so that it cannot be detached from the relations that make it. So I don't think that that's easier to say than to implement, but that's something that the current idea of inheriting this event in a different way may provoke us to think about. Jason.
Well, just very quickly, I think there's a common thread between the question about Africa and the question of Greece. Finance capital needs to be euthanized. We need a global public utility banking. The debts need to be wiped clear. And then a longer discussion about what reparations would mean needs to occur. In the history of the world in 7 cheap things, Raj Patel and I closed by calling for an ecological, for a reparation ecology, rather as a way of remembering, renewing, reimagining, reinventing all of these conceits of modern thought that Professor de la Cadena highlighted. So the bankers have to go. And I think it was Syriza's historical error not to pursue a social democratic path instead of a popular mobilization path, which it could have done. The question about planetary justice, yes, always, and at every point, the specter of reductionism is there. So we always have to fight for clarity and communication, which often means simplifying, but then we also have to be willing to rethink and renew and to reinvent that relationship between signifier and signify, something that I think we can learn a lot from. Marisol's talk brings this out to the fore in various ways. And so there you have it.
Okay. Thank you very much in time. So maybe we have to stop now because we are running out of time, but we will have time for questions for both of them later on in the conference. And now I would like to thank you all.
Thank you.
For the questions.
Before you guys disappear off the stage, first off, thank you everyone for just a wonderful opening session. We have a little something for each of you.
Oh, gifts.
Little gifts, tiny, tiny, just thank you very much. You can open them, you can open them. These are made here in Finland, woven. Before everybody starts disappearing on me, we do have the city reception. Hey, Just a minute more of your attention, please. There's a lot of info to get out real quick. So we have the city reception next, which is going to be at the Helsinki City Hall. If you're joining us just for this evening and you ticked the box when you signed your name in, there is now a name badge for you on the registration table. I need you to pick it up. That's going to be your ticket into the City Hall. I know that we've all been sitting for a while, and people like to get up and rush to the bathroom and that kind of stuff. I implore you to please walk the block and a half with us to City Hall, where they have really beautiful facilities, great bathrooms. I've seen them myself. But we do have, you know, the doors are open, they're waiting for us, so we really do have a quick turnaround to get there, but I promise it's less than a 5-minute walk. So I know that you guys have seen the conference volunteers in the blue shirt. Follow them over to the City Hall. But we also promise we won't leave anybody behind. So thank you, guys.